Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me for another Iron Age comic review. Today we're taking a look at Black and White Volume 1 by Thibert. This is a kind of spy sci-fi story, which is not really my genre, but you know, that kind of Black Widow-esque, Kingsman-esque thing can be fun every now and again. I've watched the Kingsman movie. I enjoyed that a lot, but really I picked this up more because I was interested in the artist and author, Thibert. And I've read his Chrono Mechanics. I actually reviewed it on this channel probably 2 years ago, maybe 3 years at this point. And I enjoyed that story a lot. He has a fun sense of visual humor in that story. His storytelling is very fast-paced. Pacing is a hard thing to discuss in storytelling. I enjoyed what I saw of it from art, that story. And I was interested what he was going to do in this story. So when he advertised it, I can't remember if he did Volume 1 before or after Chrono Mechanics, but at some point I saw a update from him on that campaign talking about Black and White. I decided to pick up the campaign with Volume 2. I got both of them together. So you're getting my thoughts on just Volume 1 right now. I'm going to do Volume 2 next. And it's a very different kind of story from Chrono Mechanics. It had a rather large cast. It had kind of a teams of rivals conflict to it, along with the idea that time was breaking down and had to be repaired. All in all, that was very nifty and very interesting. This is not quite so high concept. You have your protagonist, Reed Blackett, and he's leader of an import-export firm, and he's a former member of MI10, which is, part of the British Secret Service. And he's working with the Sung family brewery in China. Whitney Sung is the other half, white half of Black and White. And there's a lot of interesting, use of the duality symbolism in here and a couple of other things. It's also interesting that Reed's Alfred-type character is named Gray. So they're doing a lot of fun things with that kind of idea of color symbolism here. Reed is very reserved, as you might expect. And then Whitney is more of the outgoing, energetic, kind of optimistic one. There's, very clear elements of the two needing to balance each other out that are starting to play into the story here. The big thing, the conflict in the story really comes from JC, who is a rival, not exactly a rival, a former employee of the Sung family that coming back not so much for revenge, although that's an element of it, but also because the Sung family brewery is on top of some very valuable real estate that has kind of like this extraterrestrial power source buried under it. Kind of strange glowing crystals. We don't know a whole lot about that, but it's a very simple, straightforward sci-fi kind of a premise. It has a lot of spy action and a little bit of, scheming back and forth in it. So pretty good there. Physically, the book is, it's not quite as sturdy as some of the paperbacks I've gotten. I would say if you've picked up a Rippaverse comic, this is roughly comparable to that. It's not going to set any records, but it's going to hold up well to repeated reading. You can probably read it 5 or 6 times without doing any serious mischief to the pages. And while I prefer the feel of a hardbound book, this is only, I believe, 52 pages. Maybe 56. I didn't count, and there are, as usual, no page numbers, so I can't say for sure. So I don't know how well it would feel with an actual hard binding. Maybe there will be a collected version down the road. The art is really beautiful. Art's that's not going to get confusing. The illustrations by Thibert are very different from the illustrations in Chrono Mechanics. As I said before, that was a little more tongue-in-cheek. It was a little more cartoony in style, which I think fit the tone of the story. Black and White is going for a slightly more realistic tone, and the art is, therefore, consequently, far more realistic. It still looks great. There's a great balance of coloring of black and white, as you might expect. And the colorist, who looks like a team from Hack Shack Color, particularly Peria Pillai. I apologize if I mispronounced that name. But the colors are very, very good. They really complement the art in most places. And especially like some things that can be hard to do are things like, sometimes you have these glowing hollow screen type illustrations, and sometimes those are just garish. I think these blend quite well. So the art is very pleasing. I particularly like, there's this point where Blackett is in this kind of power suit, stealth suit thing. And this is his old one from when he was in MI6. It looks very, very 90s, very Liefeld-esque. And eventually that gets updated to a sleeker and more modern design. I kind of like that meta commentary on the old visuals of comics versus the current visuals of comics. Give a sense of an older piece of equipment. If this had been, like, if his modern costume had looked like this too, I probably would have criticized it. A, I'm not really a fan of that design, and B, there is kind of a nod to grounding in the world in this book, and I kind of feel like that's not the most practical design. I know there's a lot of rule of cool, but cool is a bit of a thing of taste, and I never really found those kind of Liefeld-esque designs cool. But I can see that there's kind of a visual commentary going on there. Of course, Blackett's modern costume looks like what you see here on the cover, which is a bit more what I was expecting when I opened up the book. I really feel like that is an intentional bit of visual commentary, and I enjoyed it as that. Story-wise, I pretty much summarized the story already, and this is only part 1. We can't get too deep into what happens, how this story is going to unfold, what all it means. There's clearly some very interesting elements of a sense of guilt over things you've done in the past. I don't think it's an accident that Reed is the black half of the pair. He feels like he's a bit dirtied by some of the things he's done in MI10. He's trying to set them right. That's part of why he's come out of retirement. Something is the Soongs are obviously taken advantage of, and he wants to correct that. I think those are interesting elements, and the contrast to Whitney, who also has an unfortunate past, but who is, I think, on the whole, more optimistic in both how the world will turn out and how her own life is going to turn out, makes for a nice contrast. And again, a kind of a balancing act the two characters are going to need to work out. This part of the story is more about them not working out that balance. That's okay, because this is the first half of a two-part story. Writing-wise, I think that it's a bit of a give and a take here. As I mentioned before, Thibert is pretty good at quippy dialogue. I really enjoyed a lot of the dialogue and chronomechanics. In this book, most of the quipping is done by Whitney and by Reed. And you kind of get a sense of the balance of, what their characters are and how they're going to work out a balance. Sometimes it feels a little bit too quippy, especially in Whitney's case. She does not seem to have, she's not quite, I think, as off-put by the kinds of violent things that happen to her as I would expect. Now, again, she has had a trauma in the past. Her old family homestead burned down, maybe homestead, maybe factory or warehouse or something, distillery. It burned down and her father died in it. And, that is an exposure to violence, but it's not intentional violence. It is an accident. It is a trauma, but it does not create the same kind of hardening as, being in a fight and winning in a fight would. And I would have liked to see, since Whitney seems to be able to take care of herself fairly well, I would have liked a clearer idea of where she picked up some of that hardening, some of that skill set from. And you don't always have to have that in the first book, but Blackett already has such a clear and concise backstory for his skills. We don't need to see a whole lot. I mean, if you've been part of an elite branch of the military already, it makes sense that you would be very good at fighting, commando operations, explosive use, interacting with technology, things like that. So we don't need to see a whole lot of that from him, and we don't. But I would have liked a little bit more insight into how Whitney, who is a civilian who worked in a family business for most of her life from the looks of things, picked up her sense for fighting. Did he, have a sifu who taught her a lot of kung fu or something like that. That is things that would have been nice to see in this book because it was a little bit strange. Now, given that this is a very pulpy, fast-paced world, I think you could have done that with just like, maybe a couple of lines of dialogue, a flashback panel, something like that. It's very easy, especially this early in the story, to set up those kind of things and run with them. It would have, I think, just made the story flow a little bit better. Speaking of the story flowing, one thing that really distracted me in the early pages, Whitney is in a Maltese mental hospital. You see, it says right there, Maltese mental hospital. And the rest of the story takes place around the Sung Brewery in China. And we see Reed going back and forth between these two places fairly quickly. Malta is in the Mediterranean, and China is not. That was a bit confusing to me, and I had to think about it a bit. I haven't actually done any research on this, but I suspect this Maltese mental hospital has something to do with the Hospitallers. If you're not familiar with the Hospitallers, you can watch the Maltese Falcon. That'll give you a pretty good summary of who they are. Essentially, they are a knightly order that was established during the Crusades and continues through today. And today, I believe, they basically just sort of do charitable works. They might build a hospital, for example. But the Hospitallers of St. John are headquartered on the island of Malta. So that's the only thing I can really think of to explain why Whitney would be in a Maltese mental hospital that is located in China. And it has to be located in China because we see, we see Reed Blackett and Whitney Sung and, Reed's sidekick Gray going back and forth between this place very, very quickly. And at first I thought maybe they're just using like supersonic jets. They have some kind of high-tech solution to this. But we're literally jumping back and forth between these locations on a page turn with no real serious idea of how long it's taking to go back and forth. So I have to assume they're in the same city. But it was confusing, and I actually read through the pages a couple of times asking myself, okay, what are the different things that could explain this? And yeah, what I've arrived at is that it must mean like they're funded by the Hospitallers of St. John. But there's already narration there saying we're in this place, we're in that place. I think it could have been a little more explicit and a little clearer what is meant by a Maltese mental hospital. If it doesn't mean that Whitney was actually on the island of Malta, that part of the story. But that really doesn't add up. So I don't think that's the case. Yeah, that could have been made a little clearer because I'm not familiar with any other explanation than that. It's the only one that makes sense. Maybe there are like Maltese hospitals all over the place in other parts of the country or other parts of the world that just makes sense. It was not immediately intuitive to me, and that is something. If I was editing this book, that would be the first thing I would say. This is unclear. Make it clearer. So yeah, that would really be helpful. I've already mentioned the use of quippy dialogue seems to it makes the characters a little unclearer, for lack of a better way to put it. I don't hate it, and I recognize that this is part of the genre. So if you're going for that sense of a very fast-moving, pulpy movie or story where everything just sort of happens and you're not digging too deeply into the characters, I think that would be okay. But there is this undercurrent of Whitney and Reed balancing each other out, of they're both having things that weigh on them that they have to kind of unearth and unpack and help each other with eventually. And in that case, I think having a little stronger voice for each character rather than having some of their dialogue sound very similar as they go through these. Now, admittedly, Reed is less quippy than Whitney is, but there's still a certain amount of it on every page. And it's not like the MCU where something tragic will happen and there will immediately be a quip. But yeah, the dialogue, the voices of the characters was not terribly strong. The strongest character was actually Gray, who is kind of the techie of the crew, and that was because he had that more technically minded dialogue. It was easier to pick out when he was talking. All in all, still a very, very entertaining story. And I am looking forward to reading part 2. So if you're into this kind of sci-fi thriller, and if you don't need your character work to be super nuanced, I would definitely check this out. If you're looking for a deep dive into the psychology of two people who are helping each other recover from emotional faults and find their footing again, this is not your story. But honestly, just based on that cover, I think you could tell that already. It does promise to have a little bit of that, a little flavoring of that, but I don't expect it to be a huge part. And what it does focus on, the action-packed moments, the cool techie devices, some clever thought from different characters, people getting the ropes in a new and dangerous line of work, making some mistakes and other people having to cover for it. That's all in here. It's all executed on well, and it's just as satisfying as you would expect it to be. So if you're interested in that, you can check out Black and White Volume 1, and I will be back on Friday to let you know how Volume 2 is. Until then, let me know what you thought if you've read Black and White down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.